Okay, well, I hope you can all hear me. Yep, great. Everybody looks so serious. Maybe it's the rain, um, changing everybody's mood a little bit. But anyway, just a reminder, this presentation is being recorded and it's focused on the speaker, not on the audience. And so the speaker and his or her, in this case, her material will be shown on and will be posted to ORG's YouTube channel for those who aren't able to join us or for those of you who might want to take another look at this. Okay, so, and my name is Don Isaac. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Research and Grants. Pleased to host this sabbatical talk. I might just mention real quickly, I introduced Verónica, Dr. Gutierrez, while she was speaking at a smaller seminar in the fall. And it just so happened, it was a Zoom presentation, and my wife was walking by my office here at home and overheard some of that. And afterwards, she was just like, came in and said, wow, who was that you were introducing? She was like really, really impressed. So I took that introduction and changed a little bit. And so anyway, we're going to have a go at a very impressive faculty member here. Dr. Gutierrez is an associate professor of Latin American history in APU's Department of History and Political Science. She's the newly appointed program director for an NEH grant that's administered through CLAS and some other entities on campus. And it involves developing bridge programs for students. I've enjoyed personally working with Dr. Gutierrez the past 4 years in her role as a APU's undergraduate research director. It's been a wonderful experience for me. I really appreciated her hard work. She has an earned BA in English and creative writing from the University of San Francisco, an MFA in creative nonfiction from Penn State. And then she turned to history and got a MA in Latin American history from UCLA. She advanced to candidacy in colonial Latin American history at UCLA and then earned her PhD in colonial Mexican history from UCLA. As a leading scholar in the field of colonial Mexican history, Dr. Gutierrez has close ties to Cholula, which is a city in the Mexican state of Puebla. And that's where she's done a lot of her research since the year 2005. It's been on Franciscan indigenous partnerships and the development of local Christianity in the area. She's lectured widely on these topics in both the US and Mexico, and in both English and Spanish. Her CV has many listings for speaking engagements. That includes a TEDx presentation, conference papers, many which were invited, and participation in professional or on professional panels. And one was a recent one with a group called Zippia. She was representing APU as an expert in career possibilities, along with several other faculty around the US. Really impressive work there. I happened to look at that, Verónica. But those CV listings are all in addition to several refereed articles, encyclopedia entries, and book reviews. Last year, Dr. Gutierrez received a very competitive Aauw Fellowship. I think that's the American Association of University Women, that allowed her to continue her scholarly work in the spring of 2020. Which followed her sabbatical, which was the preceding fall. And so then she came back this past fall to APU and found everything different after being gone for a year, a whole new scenario for her. And so she had to adapt to a whole new way of doing things. Well, anyway, so I've shared several things about Dr. Gutierrez here. So let me just remind you that her topic today, the title is the Inquisitor General's birth mother, María de la Paz's Transatlantic Tale of Labor, Land, and Loss in Cholula, New Spain, 1540 to 1614. Dr. Gutierrez. And by the way, at the end, she'll be ready to take questions. So as you have questions, you might want to just take note of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. I'm going to share my screen and get started here. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Don. I'm really happy to be here with you all today to talk about my new project, the Inquisitor General's Birth Mother. When I started my sabbatical in the fall of 2019, I was planning to use María de la Paz's story to anchor a chapter on women that I was writing in a broader history of the spiritual transformation of colonial Cholula. And I was interested, as Don mentioned, in Franciscan Indigenous partnerships and the transformation and development of Indigenous Christianity. And Cholula had long held a sacred identity. In the Mesoamerican period, regional leaders would come to participate in a legitimation ceremony in the Quetzal dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, before going off and assuming leadership in their home polities. Chololan also had a vibrant marketplace on a trunk line and was known for its pottery. Now, 2019, as some of you may know, was the 500-year anniversary of what is popularly known as the Spanish conquest. The scholars now contest the term because it sort of effaces Indigenous participation. And in October of 1519, Hernando Cortés and his allies came through Chololan and orchestrated a massacre before moving on to vanquish Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City, the red dot on the map here. So that fall, Fray Francisco Morales, who's an important scholar of colonial Mexican and Franciscan history, invited me to share my research at a symposium in Cholula commemorating the quincentennial of the massacre. So I went down and I gave my paper about María de la Paz. And afterwards he came up to me and he said, "Vero, this is your book." And I hesitated initially because I had long been invested in another project, but when I returned home and began advancing on with the documents, I thought, María de la Paz, she deserves her own book. So I am now sort of moving into new territory. I'm not trained as a women's historian, but it's been a really interesting sort of education for me. Okay, so you see here María de la Paz's last will and testament, and this is sort of where her story begins in 1614. And on April 14th of 1614, in the ancient indigenous city of Cholula in New Spain, María de la Paz, a well-respected widow, Castilian widow, and successful businesswoman, filed a private will, a testamento cerrado, with a local notary. 7 days later, she was dead. Now, that in and of itself is not unusual. A lot of individuals would produce a will during a terminal illness. But what distinguishes this case is that María de la Paz appears to have died of shame. So let's take a look at the opening to that document. María de la Paz, widow, citizen of the city of Cholula, ordered her private will before Juan Franco, public notary, on April 14th of 1614, before whom she also appears to have completed certain legitimate amendments on the 21st of said month. And on the same day, due to the proceedings that Hernando Calderón, corregidor of said city, initiated to open the will, he did open said will. And the aforementioned seems to have died from the disposition of all this. So this sort of raises some questions here. One, why was her will opened? Testators who wrote their own wills, sealed them, and submitted them to the notary had the expectation that the will would not be open until the testator's death. But in this case, there was a lawsuit brought against her. So colonial officials decided to open the will to proceed with that lawsuit. But the second question is, what could have been so mortifying in her will that would have caused her to die of shame? And so the answer to that, there was a secret. She named as her universal heir an illegitimate son in Spain. And again, illegitimacy in and of itself, not unusual. It was rampant in early modern Spain and in colonial Mexico, to the point where foundling hospitals had to be established to care for all of these illegitimate children. But what was interesting here is that her son was not only from a noble family, but he was the Inquisitor General of Spain, meaning he was the highest ranking official in the Spanish Inquisition. She names him as El Licenciado Don Pedro Pacheco Portocarrero, and he was a gentleman, an ordained priest, a consecrated bishop, and according to his contemporaries, he was a model inquisitor. So who was this woman, and why did she come to New Spain? How did she keep an illegitimate child secret until her death? And why would she designate him rather than her family or her own soul as her universal heir. We know something about her son, given his noble lineage and his career with the church. But we wonder, how and when did Maria de la Paz reveal her identity as his birth mother? How did relinquishing him affect the trajectory of her life? How many years did she and her son maintain this transatlantic correspondence? Was his elite family responsible for her relocation to the New World? And how did she orchestrate her success? So this project puzzles together Maria de la Paz's life and work from repositories in Mexico and Spain, revealing a story that transcends its colonial Mexican context. And it speaks into the history of women and the history of labor in the early modern Atlantic world, the development of proto-industry in New Spain, the global transition to Tridentine Catholicism, and scholarship on marriage, family, gender, illegitimacy, and inheritance. And the Inquisitor General's birth mother is, as far as I know, the first detailed study of a birth mother or a New World obrajera, that is a female owner of a textile mill. And in the book, I contend that Maria de la Paz's success hinged on being banished, first from Spain and then to Cholula. And ultimately, those forced exiles allowed her to gain the wealth necessary to reconnect with her noble son in her final years regarding his inheritance. So that Maria de la Paz's story can be reconstructed is remarkable, given that lower class women who relinquished children to higher ranking fathers often cannot be traced in the historical record, making it difficult for historians to trace and to study birth mothers. Maria de la Paz's experience was common in early modern Spain because this was a society that subscribed to a double sexual standard, that accepted men's adulterous escapades and expected legitimate wives to raise illegitimate children. Maria de la Paz was not the only obrajera in colonial Mexico, but her appearance in hundreds of folios across archives in Mexico and Spain distinguishes her with the most complete record of an obrajera from this period. So reconstructing her life advances the body of scholarship, evaluating the substance and meaning of work for early modern European women whose proto-industrial activities increased household wealth and their own economic authority, thus altering gender expectations and familial roles. Few scholars engage the Atlantic economy from a gendered perspective, and those who do study European women in the Americas generally fail to place them in an Atlantic context. So my research attempts to rectify this oversight by placing Maria de la Paz in her transatlantic context. So in addition, because she operated as a wife and a mother, which were two categories with specific legal and social ramifications in the early modern Spanish world, and she bore and relinquished an illicit child, this project addresses multiple layers of women's experience. So the project has led to an unexpected association with the Natalie Benson Latin American collection at UT Austin. A couple of years ago, they digitized the contents from the Fondo Real de Cholula from the Judicial Archive in Puebla, and they posted many of those documents on their From the Page platform. And I've joined other scholars in publishing my transcriptions of Maria de la Paz's judicial records. And this has gone a long way towards training an NEH-funded software tool to automate transcriptions of colonial Mexican script. And this will, of course, save scholars valuable research time and render the collection accessible to those not trained in paleography, like Cholula's own residents. Okay, so the project began back in the summer of 2007 when I was conducting research as a graduate student at UCLA under the guidance of Kevin Terracciano, who I'm very pleased to say is on the call today. And I came across a collection of about 25 wills from dating to 1590s in Cholula. And what interested me was that all of the testators requested to be buried in a Franciscan habit in the Franciscan church in Cholula. And that, of course, was my sort of focus at the time. But I did notice that Maria de la Paz, in Maria de la Paz's will, she was the only one who owned an obraje, that is a textile mill. And she also was significantly wealthier than the other testators. And I did email my classmate, Pablo Sierra Silva, at the time, who's now become sort of a leading scholar in colonial Puebla. And we talked a little bit about it, but it was outside the scope of my project at the time. So it didn't really make my dissertation. I don't think I even mentioned her name in my dissertation. So I have other significant documents I've come across as well. There's a 1573 Inquisition case that I'll be discussing momentarily. I have hundreds of documents or folios from the Notarial Archive, including the last will and testament that I mentioned already, that I just showed you. I have her final will from 1614, and also that same year, there's some powers of attorney and creditors. I have the will of her second husband, who claims that he had 3 children with Maria de la Paz, but given her age at this point, I think she's beyond childbearing years. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what's happening here. And then the most recent acquisition I have is from the Archivo, the AGI, the Archive of the Indies in Sevilla. And this is the will of her son, Don Pedro Pacheco Portocarrero, which allows me to know that she did have communication with him because he acknowledges the receipt of his inheritance from his mother, whom he addresses as Doña María de la Paz, which is the only time in any of these documents she receives a noble title. And that is after she has died. And I think I have a friend who's an independent scholar, Dr. Hugo Saez Gonzalez in Puebla, and he's been gathering these documents for me. And now that the archives have been closed, he's been transcribing most of them. So without his help, I think I wouldn't be as advanced in the project. Okay, so what do I know about María de la Paz? Well, I know she was born in 1540 in Guadalajara in Castile as a legitimate daughter of Juan de Córdoba and Catalina Diaz. She was from a region known as the Alcarria, which was known for its textile production. My red blocks are a little bit off here. They're supposed to be around Brihuega and Guadalajara. So in Ida Altman's Transatlantic Ties in the Spanish Empire, she talks about how over 800 people from Brihuega immigrated to Puebla between the 1550s and 1620. And Brihuega was the center of textile production in Castile. And those immigrants bring that to Puebla and make Puebla the premier textile production site in the New World. The other things I know about her is that at some point she gave birth to an illegitimate son in Extremadura, which is far from her hometown, from her home in Guadalajara. He was, at the time that she leaves him her inheritance, he was Inquisitor General living in Valencia. But when he receives that inheritance from her, he is a priest, and so he can't own anything for himself. So he leaves her estate to his bishopric in Córdoba. So these are sort of the details that I have about her. Now, the earliest document I have about María de la Paz dates to 1573, and this is when on April 1st, she goes before the Comisario in Puebla and the cathedral canon and denounces a fellow Castilian who's from Brihuega, who's an eminent, prominent textile baron, and denounces him for bigamy. And so I think this denunciation raises several questions. First of all, why would María de la Paz denounce Diego de Ansúrez in 1573 when, according to the documents, she had spent the last 6 years speaking to people about this alleged marriage back in Spain, and even including his own siblings. So the easy answer to that is that the official foundations of the Inquisition in Spain, in New Spain, were not until 1571 in November. There was, of course, an Episcopal Inquisition around, but the edicts of faith being read out and encouraging the faithful to denounce others for religious crimes really didn't come into effect until probably 1572. The other possible answer here is that it's unclear when she was married. She may have been married around 1571 or 1573. I'm not sure how much that has to do with it, though, because she makes the denunciation, not her husband, and that's another issue that I'm looking into. I'm not sure whether her marriage has anything to do with it. Another question is, why would she risk denouncing Diego de Ansúrez, who is this eminent, elite textile baron and key figure in the immigrant community, when she was not in that same circle? And one of the responses might be a possible conflict. So Andrés de Ansúrez, who is a sibling to Diego de Ansúrez, states in the proceso that he had heard about some anger that had occurred between Diego de Ansúrez and María de la Paz. So it's possible that this is what happened. Ida Altman, in her book Transatlantic Ties, spends about 10 pages discussing this Inquisition case, and she says she can't really imagine anything but malice motivating María de la Paz. But I'm trying to investigate that to see if I can find a clearer answer. The other sort of clue I found in the text was when María de la Paz states that going to confess, her confessor refused to hear her penance until she gave notice about what she knew to the Holy Office. It may be that she heard an edict of faith, which requests the faithful to denounce anyone for religious crimes under the pain of excommunication. So it might be that she was responding to one of those edicts of faith. One of the other questions I had was, how could she have spoken with so many people over so many years and not have realized that Diego de Ansúrez had been tried by the Inquisition for this very same issue of his first marriage in Spain 20 years before and had been released? How could she not have known that? So was there possible witness collusion? I'm not really sure. And then lastly, given that the Holy Office suspended the case pending further inquiries in Castile and never followed through, what were the circumstances contributing to the ultimate dismissal of this denunciation? And part of it is due to the nebulousness of marriage in 1553. This was before the Council of Trent in its 24th session codified marriage in 1563. So prior to this, two individuals would state their desire to marry one another, and there wasn't a whole lot more beyond that. Whereas the Council of Trent codified that and said there needed to be banns of marriage read out in advance and a priest and two adult witnesses. So that makes it unclear whether he really was married or not. The other thing is Diego de Ansúrez was one of the elite, and so was the comisario, the Inquisition official in Puebla. And the document talks about how Diego de Ansúrez approaches the comisario in the garden one night. They talk, and he tells him how sorry he is, but he's pretty clear that he never had been married before, and they talk it through. So that's another issue. Another possibility is that the comisario was ill. He was overworked. He was exhausted, and he wrote to Mexico City saying, "Please replace me. I'm tired." So this process then may not have been at the top of his mind. And then there was also a turnover of Inquisitor generals in New Spain at the time. So there are all these sort of reasons why the denunciation is ultimately, nothing happens. I know Altman claims in her book that there was no real consequences to the denunciation, but I beg to differ, because for María de la Paz, there was a consequence, namely that she was driven out of Puebla and she had to move to Cholula. So the next time we see her, she's living in Cholula and she owns a panaderia or a bakery and has hired various indigenous servants. And a few years later, she's widowed. Her husband at the time was traveling. He died in Honduras. And at the time, this route here was a popular point of exchange for cacao, indigo, and other dyes associated with the textile production. And mill owners would often send their goods or their capital south of the partner or make the journey themselves, sometimes staying up to a year. So it may have been on one of those journeys that her husband died unexpectedly without a will in 1591. And María de la Paz had to expend a lot of energy, and I have a lot of documents where she is appointing a power of attorney to try to ensure that she receives what is rightfully hers as his wife. And part of that is calling witnesses to attest to the fact that they were legitimately and sacramentally married. So the witnesses place her marriage between 1571 and 73, and they state that she was married and veiled according to the Holy Mother Roman Church. And it appears as if this may be a reference to velación, which was a separate rite that took place after the nuptial vows, where a veil was placed on a woman's head to symbolize her virginity, which of course she wasn't because she had an illegitimate son in Spain. So the question is, did she not tell her husband? Did she tell her husband and they did the velación anyway? How closely tied was velación to virginity? And I'm looking into her references to her second marriage to see if I can see what happened with velación in her second marriage. After she's widowed, she becomes known as La Viuda Obrajera, or the widowed textile mill owner, and she's really active in the documents. In 1592, which is not long after her husband's death, she invests in another obraje, another textile mill. By 1593, I have definitive evidence that she owns one, but she may have had a smaller establishment before, which might have gone with a different name. So I sort of think she may have owned it prior to 1593. In 1594, she's imprisoned alongside 6 other obrajeros, all men from Cholula, for locking their native people, their native workers, in at night. Unfortunately, this was common. Often obrajeros would bring a priest in on Sundays to hold mass, so they couldn't be accused of not providing for the spiritual care of their workers. But obrajes were insidious places of violence and abuse and were often used to punish criminals. So this is not unusual behavior, but she gets out very quickly. There's a document where she's writing to an important contact in Mexico City, and within a few days, she's in the documents again, buying and selling land in Cholula. And over the next few years, she's very active in various industries. She hires a baker, a mule driver. She gets very ill in 1595 and writes the will that I mentioned already. She recovers, she hires a mule driver, and she contracts 27 different Native people from regional locations, not just from Cholula. So her assets in 1595, as I mentioned earlier, I noticed she had significantly more assets than the others in the collection. She had an hacienda, her houses, and a textile mill with 40 workers and 6 looms, about 20,000 pounds of uncleaned wool, 300 pounds of blue and white yarn, 500 pounds of cochineal, which is used to make dye. It was the bug that would feed off of the red fruit on the nopal cactus, and 300 bushels of wheat. She also lists things like clothes, a bed, 6 slaves, 2 horses, and a mule. For her slaves, she indicates that they had 6 months to earn their freedom by paying off her debts. And if not, then the creditors could sell or auction them off to pay off the remaining debt. In comparison, in her 1614 will, she has a home plot behind her obraje, and her obraje, which includes houses, equipment, and indios. And I have the values here because an inventory was done because of that lawsuit, so I know how much these items were worth. She also had 5 slaves that she gifted to the Carmelite convent in Puebla. She stipulated that they should perpetually serve the Carmelites, and the nuns couldn't sell them, but the slaves could buy their freedom. And then she also frees 5 slaves, a mother and 4 children, because of the great devotion and good service and love that she felt for them. Okay, so the book so far is divided into 5 sections. In the early life and faith, I open with the 1573 Inquisition case and explore Puebla's reputation as a Catholic city with traditional gender expectations. And this analysis brings into focus the complexities and political machinations of the early years of New Spain's Holy Office of the Inquisition and its relationship to Puebla's commissariat. They were both founded in 1571, and this analysis reveals the broader context leading to the denunciation's ultimate dismissal. And I'm presenting this research at a conference in a couple of weeks. And I round out the chapter with María de la Paz's early life. Records indicate her son was born in Extremadura, not in Guadalajara. And scholars dispute his birth date. So I sort of wonder, was she able to, did she hide her pregnancy? Was she able to care for him for a while before the family came and took him away? It was common practice for families sometimes to hide pregnancies and to move their daughters elsewhere. I also wonder, did the son's noble family send her to the New World to prevent future interference? And it's also possible that Inquisition scholars, I've spoken to several scholars of early modern Spain, and they don't know the illegitimate son, the Inquisitor General's birth mother's name is not known. So it's possible that I might have found something important also to early modern Inquisition scholars. In my second section on labor, María de la Paz, she's driven out of Puebla after the dismissal of the case, the Inquisition case, and she moves to Cholula, a Mesoamerican holy site and marketplace. But rather than derail her, the relocation galvanizes her. Cholula is a smaller city. It only has 5 obrajes rather than the 37 in Puebla, which was New Spain's top textile producer. And Cholula was an ancient Mesoamerican commercial center with a predominantly native population located on a trunk line to the coast and to the south. It provided ready access to native labor and to long distance travel and trade. And unencumbered by the traditional gendered society in Puebla, she became Cholula's only obrajera, the female owner of a textile mill, adapting to an indigenous context in which men and women exercise complementary roles, and embedding herself in a millennial-long economic system fueled by women's labor in textile production. And she also associated with colonial officials in Puebla, Mexico City, and Honduras. So her success was propelled in part by not having to shift to more expensive African labor in her obraje. And this is because as a woman, she wasn't affected by the colonial decrees prohibiting male mill owners, who relied on indigenous labor from sitting on cabildo or town council. As a woman, she couldn't sit on town council. So she was not, she had no pretext to expend her resources arranging a fictive sale of her obraje or transitioning to more expensive African slave labor. Like her male counterparts, she could instead depend on indigenous labor. And so operating in both the Castilian and indigenous context fostered her success. In the third section on land, I discuss how as María de la Paz acquired and sold land in Cholula, she interacted with fellow Iberians, indigenous commoners, and indios principales, or native nobility, specifically the 5 Buenaventura brothers. And in the 1590s, the brothers portioned off Cholula's Mesoamerican Altepemili, or the community land near the marsh, several plots of which María de la Paz purchased. So here I read the brothers' petitions to sell land against their extensive notarial record to determine the impetus for these sales. And I place this analysis within the current scholarship on land transactions in colonial Cholula to highlight María de la Paz's role in the shifting of its ancestral landscape. And this chapter comes the closest to approximating indigenous response to María de la Paz's rising prominence in Cholula. In section 4, I examine her qua widow. So after the death of her first husband in 1591, María de la Paz, as I've mentioned, becomes known as La Viuda Obrajera. And so I examined the records of her extensive business dealings, investments, and accumulation of wealth between marriages, analyzing her activities as a widow. Given the social, political, and economic repercussions of holding the legal status of viuda or widow in early modern Spain and New Spain, I question whether María de la Paz operated within those prescriptions, transcended them, or perhaps did a bit of both. And in the last section, end of life, I discuss how around the turn of the century, María de la Paz remarried a fellow Castilian with whom, as he states in his will, she had 3 children. So I investigate why in her 1614 will, María de la Paz bequeathed her assets to her illegitimate son, rather than to her family or to her own soul, as she had done in the 1595 will. And this chapter considers how the existence of María de la Paz's secret child affected the trajectory of her life, and why shame overtook her when her secret became known. I also reflect upon gendered attitudes to illegitimate children, which would lead her second husband to be cavalier about his hijo bastardo, his bastard son, in his own will. So my tentative conclusions, the study identifies these sort of 3 defining moments that might have derailed a less determined woman. So the first would be bearing and relinquishing an illegitimate son in her youth. The second being banished from Puebla following the 1573 Inquisition case. And 3 would be being widowed suddenly in 1591. María de la Paz was a multifaceted woman touched by loss, secrecy, and shame. And she navigated both European and indigenous societies, controlling and enhancing her estate and concluding her life in a very human way, bequeathing to the son she left behind the only item she had to offer, her wealth, following nearly a lifetime of silence. Thank you.
Okay, we could have a 15, 20-minute question and answer. It might just be easy if you were to speak up and ask your questions. Let's see.
Veronica, I really enjoyed that presentation. So this fascinating project. I can't wait to learn more. So congratulations. I have a few questions. Do we know anything about Don Pedro Pacheco's father? I don't know if you mentioned anything about that.
No, I didn't mention that. I haven't quite gotten to that piece of the project, but because they were a noble family, I will need to go through some books on early modern Spain and learn more. What I did learn was that the illegitimate son, his half brothers, they were really important. His mother, I think, served the queen in some capacity. One of them was a knight of one of the higher orders who died a glorious death. There was another one who did some work with the Inquisition. So this is a very elite noble family. And perhaps there might be some clues studying them that kind of reflect back on María de la Paz.
a remarkable woman, 25,000 pesos, her obraje is worth. That's a lot of money in that period. Do you think that as a viuda, it gave her more ability to accumulate capital and wealth, and gave her an advantage in a way? I mean, I think that, widows in this period are able to, in some way, escape patriarchal restraints and to, and to operate independently. It's sort of unusual for a woman to be operating so independently. It seems like being a widow gave her a certain advantage in that way.
From the reading I've been doing, she was not the only woman who was in a similar situation, but women often did decide not to remarry after being widowed because they could inherit the estate that they shared with her husband and continue in whatever operations that they had done together, and also to continue to expand. Um, she had enough capital, it appears, to very quickly invest in a different obraje. So that allowed her then to diversify and to become involved in various enterprises. I'm still going through those documents to find more clues. But I do sort of think that that's really when she explodes into the historical record as this viuda obrajera. And people sometimes, the notaries don't even always write her name. They just call her la viuda obrajera. So that really indicates to me that she's the only woman who owns an obraje in Cholula. And just everybody knows who she is. So she's gained this sort of reputation. And that sort of leads me to question, why would she remarry? I don't know that. I haven't gone through the will enough to determine that, the will of her husband, to determine that. But I was sort of surprised that she would remarry. But there must be something to that part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much.
Veronica. Hi, Veronica. This is
Hey.
Margarita. Thank you for inviting me to your sabbatical talk. It was a pleasure to listen to this. Along the lines of what Kevin was saying, I think that if anything, right, one of the major contributions of really sort of unraveling, right, this history around María de la Paz is that it really underscores that we still have a lot to learn about women's history for colonial Latin America and colonial Mexico, even when it comes to, right, women such as María de la Paz, right, who is a Castellana, right, this Castilian woman. And for someone like this, right, to have such a rich corpus available, it's really amazing. For those of us who work with the indigenous population, right, and women, to come across such a rich collection of sources, to be able to trace her back to Spain, right. My God. But I have a question, but I want to make one more comment. In terms of the, all the questions you're asking around, right, sort of her widowhood status and her abilities, right, to engage in this economic enterprise of the textile industry, if you will, and her sort of legal abilities and so on, right, why she put forth this bigamy case, why not her husband, for example. It reminds me of a parallel case. Maybe it's not so parallel, but it's the case of the mother of Rodrigo de la Paz. Rodrigo de la Paz, if you don't know, was Hernan Cortez's nephew, I believe, or cousin. And he was the guy who was left in charge when Cortez, took off to Honduras early on. And then the early Inquisition apparatus really came after him, tortured him, and then eventually sort of executed his already dead body. But in that case, it was his mom, right, who engaged in several, right, unlawful death legal suits, and she did so from Spain, right, for her son out here. And this involved, of course, his will and everything he had. But anyway, just there's she immediately comes to mind in terms of like the questions you're asking around women and their abilities economically and legally and so on. And we could talk more off this call if you want about that, and I could recommend some literature. But then I have some pretty pointed questions. I know you said that there's a sense maybe that that María de la Paz had other children. I would want to know, does she have other children? And then what, in terms of legitimacy, right? what do we mean by that? Was he recognized as a bastard, as a hijo espurio, as a bastardo by people out in Spain? The literature, right? The literature really speaks to how hijos naturales, or persons for whom, right, it wasn't public and notorious that they had, right, this bastard sort of background. They led, right, pretty comfortable lives, especially if they were part of the elite. And this guy seems to be very much, right, interconnected. So my questions are really around that, right? How are you unraveling legitimacy here? Because in some ways he may, anyway, how are you unraveling legitimacy? And also, were there other children? And then lastly, I'm just curious about all of this shame. Did she mention shame? Maybe I missed it in the first part of your presentation, but did she mention herself as having shame? Or, were those whispers from other folk, right? Because if this turns out to be her only child, she is fully, right, in her full legal capacity to bequeath the entirety of her estate to her child. Anyway, those are my questions. And I'm happy to chat gender and women and
Yes,
legal and stuff
please.
anytime you want.
No, that's a great.
Can I add a question about shame? Because because again, I don't know the context at all, and so but I was just wondering what shame means in this context, and she's again in this like dynamically cross-cultural situation, right? And so you've dealt with Spain, but you've dealt with Puebla, and then you've dealt with Cholula, and I was wondering, like, is there a difference between shame even in Puebla versus Cholula? Is there does shame mean something different between the indigenous Cholulans and the Spanish Cholula? Yeah, I'm just curious. So just to piggyback on the previous question about shame.
Thank you, Paul. That is a good question. And I'm still, as I said, I'm not trained in women's history. So all of these are great observations. I really appreciate the insight into different avenues that I still need to explore. But to sort of go back to Margarita's question, one of her observations about Pedro Pacheco Portocarrero and how did he sort of live his life in Spain, I found one text about the Inquisition in Valencia that acknowledges he was illegitimate. But I haven't found anything beyond that. So at least scholars now know he was illegitimate, but I don't know if any scholars prior to my discovery of María La Paz made the connection between who his mother was. But I need to investigate that to see how did he live his life. And maybe that was part of this secret. If maybe, I don't know, did she make an agreement? Did she never speak about it? I haven't, I don't know the answer to these questions. I haven't been to Spain yet to do that part of the research. Most of my work has been in Mexico at this point. So I'm waiting on funding and waiting on the archives to reopen so I can go to Spain and try to, tease out some of this information and find the answers, because I think that would be really important to understand the connection. And that's why I asked that question, how long did they keep up this transatlantic correspondence? I have at least one document from the end, her leaving her estate to him and then him accepting the estate and then bequeathing it to his bishopric. But beyond that, I don't have anything else. And I don't know whether I'll be able to find anything else.
I have a question about the process of the research. What exactly are you handling when you go to the archives? Like did you actually go to UT Texas, Austin?
No.
Or did they send stuff to you, or are they sending photocopies or that? I was wondering about that, just kind of the mechanics of that, but also related to that, are you actually looking at these documents? And okay, first of all, you have to, before you can even interpret them from, say, Spanish, and it might be a different type of Spanish and modern Spanish. There's also the issue of what are how the actual inscription.
Yes.
Do you have to interpret all that, or do you? How does that work?
Yeah, so the UT Austin connection, that was all digitized. So the Judicial Archive from Puebla, that was digitized. So I didn't have to go to UT Austin for that. But for most of this other work, historians usually we do. And I spent a lot of time in Cholula and in Puebla going to various archives. gathering documents. And as I mentioned, now I have Hugo, who was on the call, I think, who's been helping me a lot because he lives in Puebla. So he's been gathering documents, putting onto a shared Google Drive. But yes, so what we see in the archives are these bound books of colonial documents, 16th and 17th century documents. Oftentimes we wear white gloves or masks as we go and handle these materials. Some archives will allow you to make photocopies. Some of them prefer, you take photographs. Sometimes it's very difficult to get permission to do either. And you need to, make notes of these documents. So once I have the documents, then if they're short documents, then I usually can just transcribe them. So just type out the Spanish from the paleography is sort of a specific skill historians learn how to read this colonial script. I took a course actually at UT Austin years ago to learn how to do that.
Oh, okay.
So we transcribe the documents into Spanish, and then if they're really, really long, I often like to translate them into English, just so I have both languages, so I can really think. It helps me to think out what exactly does it mean. A lot of these documents don't have punctuation. So you have these pages of just long sentences and you have to figure out, and then the pronouns in Spanish are unclear sometimes, whether it's referring to the woman or the man, like what's the antecedent here. So you often have to, and sometimes that's why historians come to different conclusions about the same documents, because of the lack of punctuation. We just kind of say, oh, I think it reads this way. And then someone else might read it and say, no, I think it reads this way. And then there are other documents. I have some from Cholula written by native people in Spanish, and the Spanish is atrocious. The grammar doesn't make any, the words don't make sense because they're native speakers who are writing in Spanish. So you also have that issue, sometimes sort of a nahuatlization of the Spanish. But that's sort of the mechanics of how it works. So it takes a long time to even get to the point where I can start to analyze the work.
I'd like to hear more about the obrajes themselves. And you used a phrase, something like a millennia-long economic system of female textile production.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to get more of a sense both of the long sweep of this movement, but also a typical obraje, or one like Maria de la Paz operated. What would be its scope? How much production? Who would it be selling to, and so forth?
And to the rest of you, that question is coming from Princeton.
Yes, my colleague, Dr. Schramm. So there's a lot of literature on obrajes in this period, and they sort of they have different names depending on the size. I think they have to have at least 6 looms to be called an obraje before, if they're smaller, then they're called something else. But sometimes the obrajeros live there on the property somewhere, and they're sort of involved. I don't think that I can answer the specifics of how much production, because I haven't gone deeply enough into the obraje literature to really understand that. But as I mentioned, these were really dark and vicious places. And there's even sources and records of people blaspheming deliberately to try to get denounced to the Inquisition, to get pulled out of the obraje, that they'd rather face the Inquisition than be in an obraje. So that gives you a sense of how bad some of these places were. Lots of people forced to sleep in a room together, kind of on top of each other, never being allowed to leave, even though they're supposed to. But some of them were imprisoned there because that was their punishment for criminal offenses. So that it functioned in a way as a working prison. So if that gives you a sense. So I'm not sure whether hers, I don't have any indication of that in the documents. But as I said, she was imprisoned for locking in her native people at night. So I know that she was engaging in some of those very common practices at the time. As far as the millennial-long tradition, that was in Cholula. There was a textile production. Native women fueled textile production in the Mesoamerican period. And a lot of Europeans, when they arrived, were sort of surprised at some of the incredible textiles being produced in the Americas. And so my point is that being that she moves from a Spanish colonial city, Puebla was established by the Spaniards for themselves. I mean, native people built it, but the Spaniards designed it to live there. Whereas Cholula was a neighboring town. It was already there, pre-existing. It's been there. Some scholars argue it's the oldest continuously inhabited city in the Americas. And so it has this really long tradition of trade and a marketplace, and as part of that whole sense of Native women being engaged in textile production. Therefore, her as a woman coming and being involved in the textile production, it seems like that is a significant boost for her to leave the Spanish city of Puebla and come to an indigenous city where women were already associated with the textile, textile production. And so that I'm sort of making the suggestion that aided her in her success by moving to a smaller place.
Okay, well, as we come to the end, is there somebody who might have one last question? There's one on the chat.
Oh, yes. Paul was asking what kinds of textiles, plant fiber or wool. It would vary depending. I think the ones that María de la Paz had based on what she had in her inventory on her will was wool in production. Native peoples would use cotton, I believe. So there were different kinds of textiles. And then there was the silk industry with silkworms, mulberry trees. I think, was it Martin Cortés who was involved in bringing mulberry trees, I think, early on to colonial Mexico. So there were different kinds of production, but I believe María de la Paz was involved with wool production.
It's also interesting to note that that she attacks another obraje owner. I think that, we know that these inquisitorial denunciations were often aimed at rivals to bring them down. And so it's really interesting how she has the nerve to attack one of the, the leading obraje owners while establishing her own presence as an obraje owner. I think that says a lot about her and her abilities.
Right. I think it does speak to the type of person she was. She seemed to be a very determined person, despite all of, having to give up her son. And I'm not sure about the circumstances leading for her to come to the New World, but leaving him behind, possibly not being able to communicate with him, but working hard even after her husband dies. And then in the end, at least at the very end, she was able to reestablish contact, but perhaps she did that earlier. I simply don't have the evidence yet, but I agree, Kevin. She's a very, very bold person.
Okay, well, hey, thanks so much, Dr. Gutierrez, for a really interesting presentation. This is kind of the second time I've heard this, and I'm more fascinated every time I hear it, and I learn a little bit more about María de la Paz story. It's really fascinating, and I want to say thank you to everybody who has taken the time to join us, and want to remind you that it will be on the ORG Office of Research and Grants for APU, our YouTube channel. If you want to, if there's something you didn't catch and you want to see it again. So thanks so much, everybody, for coming. And Dr. Gutierrez, just as a token of my office's appreciation, we've made an arrangement. Usually I would be on stage with you and hand you an envelope at this time saying thank you very much. Instead of handing it to you, I'll just verbally say that we've made a small token of addition to a local, to an upcoming pay period for you. Just as so if you see your pay period's a little bit different, that's not a permanent boost.
Okay.
That's an appreciation for your good work and presenting to us today. Okay.
Thank you so much, Don. And thank you everybody for coming. It's really a great experience. All right. Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.